Hey, it's Brett, and this is the second part of uh, Hope in the Collapse by Punch Up, Kick Down, Distro from 2025. We cannot know how things will play out. Letting go of prognostication frees us to most effectively address whatever comes our way. It is as if giving up on saving the world opens us up to doing things that will save the world. Charles Eisenstein in Climate. The harsh reality is, in many ways, we have already been defeated. The fascists are winning, politically and culturally. The collapse is in full swing. To be brutally honest, most people feel utterly powerless to enact meaningful change on the necessary scale because humankind may have missed its opportunity to fully avoid catastrophic collapse. The powers that be have us right where they want us, in most respects, scurrying around for the basic survival in a state of psychological dismay and social precarity. So, with that being the case, what now? When individuals, communities, and society at large face the chaos that collapse guarantees, we will be forced to ask ourselves, who will we become now? Knowing we cannot win, what will we do? Richard Seymour suggests we give up without giving up. We despair, but we do not submit. Despair without fear, without resignation, without a sense of defeat. Can we make the revolutionary changes necessary to confront the collapse before it is too late? Do we have any chance of saving the world before human civilization is completely eradicated, taking much of the planet's non-human life with it? How we answer these questions should not affect our willingness to, as best we are able, embody our ethical principles and remain committed to shared values, that nobody is disposable, that the natural world has intrinsic value, and that the current social order is not inevitable. Radical hope is not attached to outcome, but dedicated to ethical principles and committed to social responsibility in the face of impossible challenges. The authors of Joyful Militancy define ethics not as an individualized set of principles, but instead a capacity to be attuned to the situation, to be immersed in it, and create something emergent out of its existing conditions. What is important is not anticipating exactly what is going to happen, but retaining our basic humanity regardless of what happens. Let us refuse the inevitability of a social arrangement of domination which robs us of dignity and meaning. Let us accept uncertainty, because freedom from uncertainty is no freedom, according to Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. There are no guarantees, but there are possibilities. We can dedicate ourselves to ethical principles of compassion without losing our teeth. We can direct our vitriol toward the systems of oppression which threaten us all, rather than becoming individuals who are fellow victims of these structures and logics. We haven't got a chance in hell. But if we remain steadfast in our principles, the sacrifice and dedication required to make radical change is experienced not as a begrudging duty, but an irresistible desire. We engage radically different ways of living because we cannot help it. We act in accordance with our beliefs, driven by radical hope, because we feel called to, because we long for something better. If this calling is our foundation for action, rather than a delusional expectation of verifiable success, stultifying adherence to dogma, or an attempt to assuage guilt, these actions are authentic and far more likely to build meaningful connections and resilient communities. There are worse things than failure. They include capitulating to the grotesque logics of capitalist society, accepting violent forces of domination, and coercion is inevitable and perpetuating the cruelty and injustice of our world. Despite being one of the most catastrophizing doomers in the discourse surrounding the collapse, Guy McPherson captures these ideas well. What better judge of our characters than how we act in the face of impossible odds? Comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable on our way down seemed like perfectly reasonable strategies to me. We're all gonna die, but that's not what this moment is all about. The focus must be on how we live. From I Want a Better Catastrophe. In both nihilism and cruel optimism, we find convenient excuses not to act, to maintain our personal comfort without challenging our assumptions or thinking critically. Both these positions are moral abdication, and together they suggest a false dichotomy, writes Kathleen Dean Moore in I Want a Better Catastrophe. Whether the principles are successful in some abstract evaluation is of less concern than how they orient our lives as we live them. The uncertainty and impossibility of confronting the collapse in totality calls for a reorientation of the purpose of our political principles, as well as the meaning we ascribe to the actions we take. Rather than an abstract sense of individual righteousness, what becomes important, as Loy puts it, is not the unattainable goal, but the direction of one's efforts, a direction that orients us without providing any endpoint. From Eco-Dharma. The human desire for ontological security is threatened under psychologically chaotic and material cruel conditions of the collapse. By letting go of attachment to results, we unlock unlimited potentials for what the future may look like, while we remain grounded in ethical values of compassion and political principles of liberation. We are given a choice: cling to ideology, live in a state of perpetual existential dread, indulge in the delusion that things will remain this way forever, or let go of the reins and accept that the future is unknowable and unpredictable, harnessing that uncertainty to steer the course of history away from the further cruelty and towards dignity. Paraphrasing Matt Christman, we have let down our shields, not to reinforce them. We cannot control what's coming, so our instinct is to batten down the hatches. But the shield has already been broken, so the question is, are you going to spend your time between now and whatever you're afraid of arrayed against yourself and against the people around you, robbing yourself of the ability to have a genuine sense of connection and security? Frantically hurting yourself in the long term by distracting yourself in the short term? If you accept that the shields have already failed, you can avoid fixating on fear of the unknown. We benefit from refusing to separate the effectiveness of any tactic or strategy from its effectiveness, how it makes people feel, how it nurtures autonomy or dependence, writes Charles Eisenstein in Climate. Relinquishing attachment to specific outcomes in any given struggle creates a presence and attentiveness to the process of the struggle, shedding light on its most important elements: caring, loving, community-oriented relationships. Liberation through relation. The concept of community itself can be a sort of illusion, a desperate attempt to articulate a set of social relations which simply cannot exist in the devastating conditions of modern capitalist empire. The economic and technological infrastructure of modernity has robbed us of the skill sets, command social structures, and intimacy with the land on which we have relied for nearly all of human history, while alienating us from one another. However, caring human relationships based on solidarity and reciprocity are the foundations of a meaningful response to the collapse. Even if imagined, community is an expression of our hopes for what the world can be. as Pinko Collective puts it. They continue, though we may be mistaken about the resiliency or depth of our current social relationships, we are speaking a fantasy that expresses our political desire. Community at its best is our aspiration for genuine interdependence, effective mutual care, and a shared collectivity of human flourishing and after accountability. Peter Gelderloos, for his part, claims that community is nothing if not a unit of shared survival. He writes, in Organization, Continuity, and Community. If that is the case, the collapse may pull us kicking and screaming into community, and during the coming fallout will necessitate a radically different formation of social and communal relationships. That transformation will be articulated by what we must do to survive. Rather than any particular political vision or ideological framework, it will be the means by which we meet our basic needs that might direct us toward the more communal, egalitarian social relationships. When the power goes out, or there is a flood, we are more likely to check in with our neighbors. In the extreme, that propensity might give us a glance at what the future may hold. Our interdependence and our collective nature might be revealed through the terrain of crisis. This will be far from romantic. Harsher material conditions will be experienced unequally according to social and economic status. However, for a majority of people, the collapse may create conditions which bring us, by necessity, into more embodied, less alienating social arrangements. The versions of ourselves which the moment calls for are forged in the literal fires of the collapse. Radical hope pulls us towards tendency in our lives as we live them. If we know that we cannot not depend on hierarchical, class-based power structures to help us in the collapse, consciously or not, worsening conditions may force people into interdependent, localized networks of mutual aid, communal problem solving, and reciprocal relationships. We may find in this great unraveling the kinds of acts of solidarity which are inherent in human communities under crisis or tragedy. Our human tendency to pull together in emergency situations, even to risk our lives helping others, is well documented. From Joanna Macy's Act of Hope. Human nature is one of cooperation, and disaster often brings this out in us. When the power goes off or the tap stops flowing, no amount of weaponry, prepper gear, or stockpiled toilet paper will matter if we are not engaged in a reliable community of people we can trust. As the effects of the collapse worsen, it is a community of people we are in physical contact with, whose well-being we are invested in, and who are invested in our well-being, which will be the most important resource of all. Establishing these relationships requires we dismantle the capitalist mythology of human nature as inherently cruel and selfish, and recognize that it is capitalist exchange relations themselves which have all but erased the interdependent community relationships in which humans have organized themselves, generally speaking, for the majority of our history. Though embodied, face-to-face relationships through embodied face-to-face relationships of mutual reciprocity and material interdependence, we might build exemplary frameworks for the resistance of capitalist logic. This is a vision of the future that we must create the foundations for, here and now. The process prioritizes the future that we must create. The process prioritizes the nurturing of relationships over rhetorical political theories. It means that even in the face of certain doom, we show up for each other in interpersonal relationships and compassion for ourselves and others as best we can. Peter Gelderloos writes, "If we fight in a way that is consistent with the world that we want to defend, then every step we take, even if we don't make it all the way, leaves the world a better place and could make the difference between life and death for a person, a community, an ecosystem that right now is under threat. Recognizing that we live only thanks to a beautiful web of relationships with countless other beings, nurturing those relationships is the best possible way to live. He writes, and the solutions are already here. Easier said than done. Relationships are hard. The challenge of collectivity is exasperated by our highly alienating social environment. The kinds of relationships we need to cultivate must be resilient enough to endure interpersonal conflict and material adversity, the messiness and chaos of being a person in relation to other people. Gelderloos continues to articulate this idea beautifully, so I'll just continue to quote him at length. At a certain moment, we need to risk ourselves. We need to drop our guard. The revolution is not the geometric expansion of our bubbles of autonomy, of our safe spaces. It is not a trajectory with an endpoint in which we have all become perfect hosts for our principles and theories. It is a complete change in everything. We ourselves will not exist, not as we currently know ourselves. It is an insanely optimistic expansion of trust and solidarity to include nearly everyone else on the planet. That is why the idea of community is so important. It's not a group of friends and not an enclave of perfect souls. It is simply a body of people of all sorts, all rough around the edges and imperfections, who share their survival. The supreme act of optimism, then, is not the belief that everyone will somehow become better, but that we will dare to lower our shields and approach life in a way that constantly beckons toward shared community of needs and desires. We need to build and sustain community, end quote. We need to build and sustain communities that are not merely abstract ideas, but tangible networks of support, interdependence, and mutuality, embodiments of a, quote, principle of cooperation and the responsibility to each other and the earth, as Sylvia Federici puts it in Re-Enchanting the World. Projects and organizations of all shades provide an opportunity for people to participate more fully in the web of relations and affections that we are currently enmeshed in. From Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery in Joyful Militancy. For me, music is a tool for this embodied engagement. For others, it may be a community garden, a political organization, or a religious gathering. These encounters cultivate a sense of collective responsibility in which is socially fulfilling. Other people become active participants in our shared lives whose well-being we have personal investment in. By cultivating trusting relationships and reinforcing structures of sharing resources, trading skills, and establishing rituals of meaning, our deep social and emotional needs for community, belonging, and a sense of purpose are met through the collective process. As Miriam Kaba offers, everything worthwhile is done with other people. Conclusion. Pacifying delusion, ideological confusion, and false solutions abound in the discourse concerning what is to come and what will be done. While these narratives vary widely, from the wacky and conspiratorial to the grim and nihilistic, it appears to me that there are three broadly popular theories regarding what the future will look like and what we should do. Each story corresponds to a general political affiliation, harboring their own discrete fantasy about the collapse. The centrist liberal fantasy is that we shall be saved through technological advancement, most recently expressed in the abundance agenda, or what some refer to as techno-optimism, without ever confronting the underlying social conditions under which technology is produced, and to what ends. Regardless of its miraculous capability, technology cannot be removed from its social context. The world quote, "The world teems with great innovations that deserve application as ways of checking the ecological crisis," writes Covell, "but will not be used because they run against the exigencies of accumulation, an enemy of nature," end quote. He writes in Enemy of Nature. Because we face fundamentally social problems, solutions to technological progress in and of itself will mitigate the worst possibilities of the collapse. The idea that technological progress in and of itself will mitigate the worst possibilities of the collapse is a liberal delusion which fails to call into question any underlying and individualistic underlying assumptions of our social order or dismantling the reigning power structures. The reactionary conservative fantasy is isolationist and individualistic. Here we find the fascist inclination, which is quick to separate mine from thine, the prepper movement's fixation around amassing supplies sold by grifters cashing in on public anxiety, and a highly disaffected search for meaning presented through the online manosphere. This narrative generally revolves around hoarding stockpiles of resources for one's own household and protecting it with violence around from some imagined dangerous and intrusive other with explicit racist and xenophobic overtones. While being well prepared for various disasters or crises is appropriate given the accelerating ecological disasters and social volatility of our time, quote, "There is no scenario when living out rugged individualistic post-apocalyptic fantasies makes sense." And Why We Fight by Shane Burley. This capitalist logic, squeezing blood from a stone, is cashing in on its own catastrophe. Before moving to the third general narrative, let us examine how the liberal and conservative tendencies are often inverted or reflected within leftist discourse itself. While the liberals' blind faith in technological solutions is unwilling to grapple with how society is organized, some on the left cast blame on technology as such. But technology is not inherently bad in and of itself. Technology has no static moral value, according to Brittany Way in Generation Dread. Scientific and technological advancements only contribute to worsening social and ecological conditions because they are created by and in service of the hegemonic capitalist empire. Agriculture, industrialization, and modern tech are all subjected to criticism by certain leftists, but these are merely the tools by which capital accumulation is carried out. They are expressions of a kind of social organization. Modern technology could be utilized in service of a wholly different kind of society. Likewise, of the rugged individual story prevails on the cultural right, but also crops up in the imaginations of those who consider themselves leftist revolutionaries, if with different aesthetics. I know many leftists who are passionate about and put incredible amounts of time into learning practical skills, how to build shelter, hunt and trap, make their own clothes, forage and practice plant medicine. While these are fine hobbies and potentially valuable abilities, it is also fantasy to assume these primitive skills can sustain us in total isolation. We should be careful not to reshape the reactionary mindset of rugged individualism in our own image. We cannot confuse a collective utopian vision for an escapist fantasy of micro-communities walled off from the harsh conditions of the world and indifferent to the vast suffering of those outside of our subcultural bubble. While tantric meditation communes and punk rock vegan potlucks may provide much needed relief and friendship, we must remain unsatisfied with individualized contentedness among collective oppression, violence, and exploitation. Good vibes, private comforts, or performative rebellion are not enough to liberate us from the conditions of domination or mitigate the oncoming horrors of the collapse. Our response cannot be isolationist, it must be collective. This brings me to the third collapse narrative, which is also, I think, cynical and individualist. This is the anti-civ contingency, or the congruent subcultural scene which Bookchin labels lifestyle anarchism. This narrative heavily romanticizes the downfall of civilization. The old world set aflame will warm our hearts and light the way to a new horizon. We will dance and make love in the ashes, so the story goes. Sounds fun. However, the real possibility of total infrastructural breakdown would mean immediate and untold suffering for incredible numbers of people, mainly the poorest urban populations. If, for example, the electrical grid in the US were to suddenly shut down, it wouldn't take long for many people, mostly poor and marginalized populations, to die as a result. The techno-industrial society upon which our world is built simply cannot be burnt down without resulting in incredible suffering and loss of life. By no means should we advocate for the maintenance of global capitalism or the ramping up of fossil fuel infrastructure, but we must denounce what has been referred to as eco-fascism, for it is always the poor, urban, racialized populations domestically and the hyper-exploited citizens of the global south globally who are, consciously or not, the hypothetical sacrifices of this rhetoric. This is only an echo of the human disposability which the capitalist ideology has normalized, an ideology to which we should be adamantly opposed. In much the same way that killing your local heroin dealer does nothing to help people struggling with addiction, punching Nazis does not challenge the social conditions which create fascism, and exiling those we deem problematic is an avoidance of productive conflict. These are stories which oversimplify structural problems and offer individual solutions whereby one can perform personal virtue in an aesthetically satisfying way. It's important to note all of these various fantasies about what the collapse will be like contain seeds of truth. None should be rejected totally, because they all offer valid critiques and cogent predictions. Technological innovations will certainly play an important role in any confrontation with the collapse. However, neither yet to be invented magic bullet nor technocratic superhero will save the world. It should be obvious at this point. The Elon Musk of the world, as clear as any enemy there can be. Without dismantling capitalism as a social structure and hegemonic ideology, technological advances will continue to enrich the ruling class while subjecting the masses to intensifying surveillance, psychological torment, and brutalization. Being prepared for natural disasters or social emergencies within your household or community, stocking food and water, and learning basic survival skills are all beneficial in both the near and long term. However, interdependence is an illusion, and the desire for independence is an illusion, and the desire for self-determination can only be realized through healthy interdependence with a trusted community. The ability to coordinate effectively in a group, even in highly stressful moments, will be the most important skill set in the collapse. Strong communal bonds and reliable personal relationships are the most important resource to stockpile. Unique cultural affinities and looking out for one's own community fosters those bonds, but we cannot become isolated pockets of relative privilege living alternative lifestyles while grave injustices occur outside our subcultural walls. Total destruction of the dominating world is necessary, agreed. However, the decay of our current social order appears to be, at least to a certain degree, inevitable. Let's discard the angsty fairy tales in which the heroes have alternative haircuts, perfect politics, and can overthrow capitalism with one well-placed Molotov. I want to dance with you in the glow of burning police stations. Truly, I do. I also want to imagine and co-create a functional society which does not rely on violence to function, and which meets people's basic needs, and which will not send us spiraling into mass extinction, rather than exclusively fantasizing about the destruction part. While the revolutionary dreams of those who indulge in this burn it all mentality generally come from good faith recognition of the need to overthrow modern structures of power and exploitation, to advocate for the outright undoing of communications technology, modern medicine, electricity distribution, and the rest of civilization, reflects a utopian vision which is juvenile, callous about human life, and unappealing to those outside our very small social bubbles. I can absolutely sympathize with an angst-driven rage aimed at the world, a seething hatred for the way things are. This rage, though, cannot be detached from its dialectical counterweight, the hope for a better world. Richard Seymour puts it well. To despise the world in any sense must of necessity be to love another world that exists as yet only in the navels of our dreams, a world that has not yet been conceived, let alone born. World hatred is always implicitly utopian, presupposing the existence of another world where things would work better, even if there's no way to say what that would look like, even if it is unspeakable. He writes in The Disenchanted Earth, recognizing the various social spheres we inhabit and how they shape our confrontation with the collapse may be helpful to distinguish between aesthetic displays of political affinity and how our ethical principles interact with real-world situations involving people who do not share our subcultural tastes. We should make a clear distinction between our cliques and our friend groups, and the people with whom we organize large-scale political projects, and the people with whom we are in physical, local relationship with. Difficult as it may be to accept in the context of the collapse, your relationship with your curmudgeon neighbor is ultimately more important than your Twitter stats, your cool outfit, or your ability to quote theory. Politically eccentric as he may be, you know you can count on him to borrow a chainsaw or use a tow hitch, and he can expect to get some of the baked goods you made. These are the moments where we might embody our values and establish the relationships which will be critical in the collapse. While we strengthen local community relationships of resilience and mutual aid, we must also connect to wider networks of resource exchange, support in whatever ways we can to global movements and resistance, to be committed to solidarity with struggling people the world over. Our efforts cannot be exclusively localized, because any freedoms or comforts we may enjoy which rely on the exploitation and enslavement of others, be they across the globe or down the road, is not acceptable. Richard Gilman Opalski offers, our communities are precarious and tiny, and surely not enough to shield us from, let alone to reverse, global catastrophes like poverty and climate change. We do not seek only being together, but also active forms of being against. We cannot abandon the hopeful possibility for a larger struggle against the present state of things. We do not want to be islands. He writes in Communism of Love. The powerful and wealthy control the resources of land, housing, energy, and the social weaponry of carceral punishment and ideological propaganda. In the collapse, they will use these to further increase their own power and profits. We must identify and expand the terrain they are able to crush entirely or control outright. Our ability to hope, to experience meaningful connection, to love. This is where we find liberation, in our collective faith in each other, in a belief in humanity despite our misgivings. This faith does not come through adherence to a strict moral code or loyalty to political ideology, but through friendship, goodwill, and compassion. And that is the end of part 2 of 3. I keep thinking that I've got books or essays in 2 parts, and it turns into 3. So there will be another video with the conclusion of this essay uploaded later, probably today. If you're interested in learning more about some of the ideas expressed here and in general about leftism, you can check out the zines and articles, I think it's called playlist, that I have, and I've read a pretty large body of essays at this point. So you should check it out, subscribe if you want some more education. Thanks.